I think people are concerned with DevOps, or maybe not concerned, why they're interested in it, and what their goals are in doing it. And DevOps has a great component, as many of my friends know, that's about automation and making operations more efficient, which is fantastic. But there's another layer above it, the application layer, that also connects together to the business layer that I think is equally important. And it's good to know in that whole chain of things that you do in IT, how it's related, and why the things above DevOps are a good reason to be interested in DevOps. And as I'm sure you're finding out, to suffer through all the painful change required to do a DevOps thing. It's always, if someone's asking you to change, my first question is always why, because I'm very lazy and I would rather not do anything. So it's good to know what the motivation is for it. And if you're interested in the slides, I've made it very hard to see this, but if you go to cote.io/better software, you can get the PDF, and I shared it with the organizers, so they're all around. And I only say that not to be arrogant, but I have a lot of footnotes, because I like to show off how much I read. And I find that people can't click on them up here, so sometimes they need a copy of the slides. So first of all, that's me, if you can't tell. And I'll just be brief about who I am. I work at Pivotal. We have a booth down there. If you want some stickers and some hustling and us telling you how awesome we are, we have 3 banners, which is very impressive for an event that we do. So you should come check that out, and I'll only try to sell you software one more time in this presentation. So I was an industry analyst at a couple of places studying infrastructure software and other things at Red Monk and 451 Research, and I do a podcast here. Oddly enough, Matt Ray, one of the people I do the podcast with, you might remember him from yesterday. He does it too, called Software Defined Talk. Now, if you like stickers, we have stickers, and these ones are cool because they're die cast, so they're not square. So they really screw up your square packing if you're trying to efficiently pack that, but they're pretty nifty. We have a lot of them. We're happy to give them to you. I also write a monthly column at the Register, and if you're familiar with things in Britain, they don't know how to spell common words, so you can entertain yourself by seeing alternate ways to spell color and virtualization. And it's also not very nice, because it's the Register, so hopefully that's entertaining if you're into that. And I was a software developer for about 10 years, and I had a weird moment where I worked on corporate strategy and M&A at Dell. So that's me. I managed not to wear the same shirt today, so that's a personal achievement. So as mentioned, I like to start off with why organizations are interested in DevOps. Hopefully you're interested in it because it's fun to learn new things and have a reason to type other than keeping up with whatever else you might be doing. But I think, often what we hear about are how companies that are like startups and, Silicon Valley companies or technology companies are using new ways of doing software to help you do things like put a mustache on your face, or put a hat on your cat, or tell people what kind of meal you might have just eaten. There was a great series of ads on the way here from the airport about how you could take pictures of things and put silly things on them. So that's really good work that people are doing, very helpful. But there's many other companies that are regular companies helping to service what we do every day. Insurance companies, lots of banks, there's plenty of retail outlets, and other people who, depending on your perspective, might be helpful or not, like the United States Air Force. And they are adopting DevOps practices to improve the way that they do their software. And they want to improve the way that they're doing their software so that they can improve their business and what they're doing. And so I wanted to go over just 3 of these companies. And I think it's very important to think about what regular companies are doing, not just music listening companies or funny little social companies, because it makes it more real that you too, or in your organization, could change the way that you do your software and improve it. And so I'll just briefly go over these. And what's important to me is not so much like these performance characteristics of like how fast they operate and how they go, but the actual business results that they get, how they use DevOps to change and improve how their organization works. So you look at someone like Liberty Mutual, because they were using DevOps and Agile thought, what they could do is they wanted to enter the Australian motorcycle market, insurance market, and within 6 months they had deployed an application and doubled the average rate of closing deals that they had. And I'm assuming we probably all like money, so having more double the money that you would expect to have is a pretty good result. And then I'll skip the Allstate example is fun about if your car gets broken down on the road, they'll come help you out. And as you can see, they put an application into production very quickly and improved it. And they were able to introduce a great new line of revenue for themselves. Now the Air Force example is another good one where whenever they're flying fighter jets around, as they like to do in the Air Force, they have to refuel those planes while they're in the air, because I guess they don't want to land them for whatever they're doing. And normally, the way that they would plan that out is every day they had a whiteboard about the size of the screen, and there were about 10 or 15 people who would go up there and just plan everything out manually, right? So if you hear about digital transformation, this is great, because it used to be analog, and they actually transformed digitally. So they wrote some software, and I think Excel was involved, but I don't know if you consider that software or not. So they wrote some software, and they were able to figure out doing that instead of all day, they could just do that in a couple of minutes. And also they found out that they were way over provisioning, to use IT talk, the fuel that they had. So they could save about $200,000 a day in fuel because they had adopted this new way of doing software. Now I did some quick calculations, and I think that is about 15,000 or 19,000 extra steaks they could eat a day if you price the steaks at $20 US. And the joke about the Air Force is they just sit around and eat steak all the time. So I think that's a big win for the Air Force, that their airmen can have more of that steak. Also, if you haven't ever tried putting butter on a steak, that's my tip for you today. You've learned all that's really valuable in this talk. So what you see in organizations, again, I think it's very important in thinking about DevOps to focus on why you're doing it. And the reason why you're doing it is you want to improve the way that your software is functioning. You want your software to actually be useful. And as I'll get into, the way you do that is you adopt a very agile way of doing software. Now the good news is, this is from Citibank. They all, like the Register, don't exactly know how to spell things correctly, but that's fine. And you can see this quote from a high-level executive that they have. Now if you've ever been in IT, or if you've ever talked to someone who's not in IT, a CEO let alone, right? CEOs don't really use the word fail very often. I think to become a CEO, you have to promise and have some mind treatment that you'll never say that word again, because that's not a very good word to be using if you're in charge of a bank. However, reading through this, if you've delighted yourself with my large chunk of text, you can see that this executive is describing how they're going to use IT, and they have this very, in comparison to the past, humble, realistic view of software. And that view is that, to summarize, we have no idea what we're doing, so we're going to learn how to do it. And we're going to fail, because failing and learning are basically the same. You know, I don't know if you remember when you were learning, but I watched my 8-year-old son in school, and essentially what he does every day in schools is, well, he's not having lunch, he just fails nonstop, right? So the process of learning is failing over and over and over again until you figure out how to do multiplication or spell words like neighbor. It took me about 15 years to figure that out. In English, it's a very complicated word. Or maybe not, I don't know. Anyways, for me it was. So it's great that we have this pull from the business side. No longer is the business side saying, hey nerds, you keep failing, so why don't you figure that out? Instead, they're figuring out that the way that IT is going to be successful is to adopt this, as we would say in the DevOps world, continuous learning approach to things. So we have this idea that we should be continuously learning how to do things, and we would like results that are good, that match what customers want right now. And you know, I think most software, as is done, at least this is what I encounter, is done in the previous generation's methodology. Now, this sort of all is how I learned how to do software, so I'm sorry about that if you use any of my software. But in many large organizations, you have these practices in place. And this is one of my favorite. I saw this earlier this week when I was at a bank. We were in a conference room, and there was this corner, this sad corner that someone had put their Rational Unified Process poster. And you know, it's nice for it to be sort of a fun relic of doing software, but I think what's more interesting about that is at some point, someone bothered to print this up because it was a mission-critical key thing. And again, there were great results that we got with these processes, but because of things like DevOps and new approaches to software, we no longer need all of the comforting assurance that we used to get from these big, gigantic processes. There's new ways to do your software that are more nimble and more agile and allow you to not have to spend a tremendous amount of time doing doing this kind of work around things. Like I always think, these processes are great if you want to really get familiar with your printer, because you're going to be printing out a lot of documents, writing on them. I don't know if you've tried to use like an Apple Pencil to edit a big document, but it's not very good. You got to print it out. Because you got all those section heads that are like 6 layers deep, and then they have to cross-reference each other. It's sort of like you have a DBA to handle all of your document referential integrity. So anyways, these are some great things that we had in the past, but every organization I talk with that is succeeding with software, they're doing away with these processes and putting a new mindset in place. And in fact, making fun of Safe here, which is a great name for a product, is something that the Air Force raised up in a talk that they had, if you want to click on one of these links to follow it. They actually have a little joke that they put above this, but I took that joke out, so there's something for you to look forward to. So, if doing printer-driven software is not the goal that you have and doesn't get the results that you want, and if thinking that you can get your software done correctly and not fail is something that you don't accept, what is software? And by software I mean well, I guess I mean software, but writing your own custom-written software, not running someone else's software, right? How do you think about software? And this is kind of a cartoonish representation of the reality of software, if you've ever worked on it. And that is, at the beginning of doing your software, you don't really know not only how you would implement the features that you have, but very often you have a wrong notion of what those features are, right? Like you don't want to assume that in 2 years' time, the features that we're deciding on today are going to be exactly what our users and our customers need, right? Like you often end up with, because we don't have time machines, you end up with software that was useful 2 years ago but not useful now, let alone if you look at someone like the Air Force who releases their software typically every 5 years, that's a very energy-consuming time machine that you would need to have, which you don't want that. So we start off with this idea that software is exploring the unknown and figuring out something that's completely unknown, and we want to have a process in place that allows us to figure that out, rather than a process that creates, a 300-page document that thinks that it's figured something out. We need a way to actively do it. So there we go. We just figure out the software in this little device here. So this is a very simplified view of how I think about the process of doing software well, right? And it's overly simplified here, and as I show off, I've read, there's many versions of it, right? There's the lean startup, which is very exciting to read if you want to be a company that doesn't have to be profitable and will be purchased by someone else whose profit becomes after some time. It's a great instruction manual for that. And then, of course, there's the lean enterprise book, which will bring you up to speed on the Prussian military and other concerns. They go over what the cycle is, and from lean manufacturing, there's the Plan, Do, Check, Act, PDCA. And if you're one of these people who's interested in eating $15,000 worth of steak every day in the Air Force, there's Colonel Boyd's OODA loop, right? All of these are just ways of going through this loop. And although it's falling out of favor back home in the US, this is also called the scientific method. And the way it basically works is you have an unknown ahead of you, right? Like, we don't know, and I'll go over an example of this soon, we don't know how we should implement this feature to allow mobile payments, or we don't really know how people are going to want to transfer money between accounts. So let's come up with a theory of how we would do that. And whenever you're testing a theory, you need to validate it somehow. And in software, the way you validate is you not only write code for that feature, but this is the part most people skip over, is you put it in front of actual users, people as they're commonly called, and you see how they use the software and you see if it solved the problem that you have. And then you ask yourself, well, did that work? Did our theory prove to be true or not? And if it was true, then that's great. You can go solve another problem. Or maybe you can leave early so you can beat traffic. But if it didn't work, you need to come up with another theory and practice that again. Now the key to how DevOps and other things help with this loop is you can get this loop down to a week or a business week, like 5 days. And if you're moderately good, you can get it down to a day. So in a whole week, you probably don't want to work on Friday, so let's say 4. You could test out 4 different theories that you're going through here. And if you think about how that piles up over 6 months, 12 months, you have a tremendous amount of learning and theories that you've gone through. So you've gotten a lot of insight, a lot smarter about what features you need and how they actually work. So to give you an example, my fellow Americans will remember a few weeks ago we had to pay our taxes on the famous April 15th. everyone's favorite day of the year. Sometimes you get money back, or sometimes you don't. It's sort of like a lottery in a very complicated way. So the IRS, they found that there were, I don't know, sometimes people don't like to pay their taxes for whatever reason. So they're late on paying their taxes. And what the IRS does is they penalize you to encourage you to pay your taxes on time. So every day you owe a little bit more taxes, which if you didn't want to pay your taxes in the first place is kind of a bummer. Now you owe more. So because it goes up every day, you're very incented to find out exactly how many taxes you owe on that day. So the way that they had done this before was one of society's, civilization's most favorite ways of solving a problem. They had a call center. So you pick up the phone and you call the IRS. Now, first of all, no one wants to call the IRS. No one wants to call anyone, as usually, but let alone like a tax place. Now, another thing, to use the terminology of IT, is call centers are expensive. The software is expensive. The people who man them are expensive. They cost a lot more than zero, which is basically what IT tends to cost over time. And so what would happen is, because they didn't have enough resources running the service, the uptime that they achieved was about 37% uptime. What that means is that 63% of the time, if someone can check my math, they would just hang up on the phone with you. And they had a great phrase for this. They would call it a courtesy disconnect, which sounds delightful. I would like lots of courtesy disconnects in my life, but I can't seem to get enough of them. So already you've got an expensive system, and its uptime is 37%. I don't know what SLAs and uptime y'all have to support, but I'm pretty sure if your uptime was 37%, you would get the chance to go work in some other building here because you would be fired. So it's a terrible system. And so someone had the bright idea, like, oh, software, computers are good at this kind of thing. So to try to shorten what is typically a long story, they were following this small batch process. They're deploying their software every week, testing out a theory about how to solve it. And the first theory, and I've highlighted the part in orange, right? What you want to see is balance due. I owe $644, which not too bad for your over taxes. I mean, yeah, anyways, taxes, very exciting. So their theory was, being accountants, we love numbers and transaction, we're accountants. And so what we should do is we should display the complete financial relationship people have had with the IRS, right? Like, it's like when you go into your iPhone, or if you use Facebook or whatever photo thing you have, and it auto-generates, it uses the machine learning to generate these memories that you've had, so you can sit there and recall the great times you had with the tax collector. Now, of course, an accountant loves that, right? I'm sure y'all in IT like looking through logs, and maybe if you're as old as me, you enjoy a good S&MP dump. You like just looking through stuff. But it turns out no one wanted that, right? Like, they were not interested in their relationship with the IRS, because the IRS is telling them that they need to liberate some of their money to give to someone else for, like, I don't know, highways or some nonsense. And so luckily they put this in front of users, and the end user said, I don't know how much money I owe, I want to pick up the phone and call someone. So immediately, think about that kind of failure, right? Like, you've spent all of this time and money, and you deploy this thing, and it does nothing, right? So your ROI or whatever business metrics are terrible. Now, thankfully, they weren't on a regular path where they would deploy this every 12 months or more, being a government agency, maybe every 2 years or 3 years. So think about if they had deployed this, let's just be generous, it took them a year to deploy this to production. And then they found out that it didn't solve the problem. And then a year later, they could try to solve the problem. And then that probably wouldn't solve the problem well, and every year it would take them forever to go through this. And by that time, I'm not sure how the government over here is, but our government does not like the IRS, despite it being the way that they make money. It's a very complicated relationship they have. So the government is always looking to remove money from the IRS. It's kind of a strange thing, right? Like, I don't like oxygen, so let's delete it from the system. I have a lot of thoughts about tax collection if you want to talk to me afterwards. Anytime that an agency like this is constantly failing, they're going to get killed, right? Like, metaphorically. We're not that bad over there about how we run the government. And so, it's not a good situation. So thankfully, because the IRS was doing this on a weekly basis and following a small batch process, they were able to iterate over it again and again. And it sounds ridiculous when you say it, but what they found out is that when you want to know how much money you owe the IRS, all you want to know is how much money you owe the IRS, right? So they came up with this screen. shows you how much money you owe, done. No one wants to pick up the phone. They want to pay it online, and then they're done with their day, and then they can courtesy disconnect themselves. So they put this into production, and so far they've had, this is of October of last year, they've had 2 million people use it, which is a little distressing. That means at least 2 million people are not paying their taxes on time. So we need to go back to civics class, about highways. So 2 million people have used the system, and they brought in about $500 million, right? So that seems like a pretty cool business success to have. But, let me skip over this. There's all sorts of other astounding companies who get these great astounding results, right? It's an actual, like if you're feeling like you're, I don't know if you know Winnie the Pooh, but there's this character Eeyore, who basically thinks he's a terrible person, and he's just trying, or he's a donkey, so not a person. He's a terrible donkey, and he's just trying to get through life. Just trying to, just run the clock out. And I think a lot of people in IT, they have this feeling that like, well, we've got a lot of COBOL, so I don't think this can happen here. And then there's that old person who never wants to do anything. So I guess I'll go compile that COBOL. Do you compile COBOL? I don't really know what you do with it. But there's plenty of organizations that are regular organizations, from banks to retailers, telcos, all the great large organizations who can pay Pivotal lots of money, who are having success with changing and improving the way they're doing software. So how do they do this? How do they get to the point where they can go through a weekly cycle, improve the way that they do software? Well, in a large organization, it starts with management, or as they like to fancy themselves, leadership. People will say C-level. Whoever the people are who are telling you that you should work on something. And more importantly, kind of crafting what the whole entire organization looks like. And I like to go over this part first, because it's been my experience, and that management actually doesn't get involved as much as it needs to succeed at not only DevOps, but changing how their software operates. And I just finished reading that Accelerate book. I know Matt Ray gave you an extensive reading list, so enjoy your weekend. But the Accelerate is a good book from the DevOps report people, going in depth over the reports that they do and how they were done. If you ever read through the DevOps report and you're like, that sounds great, but I have no idea how you did any of that work. So you got to throw some academic stuff at me. It kind of goes over that and reassures you about how they do the work. But as they point out, currently, leadership and management are the least involved. So it's little wonder that there's a scaling problem with DevOps and getting it to apply more broadly. So are there any managers in the room or leaders? That's great. Let's make fun of them. So I think these are like a gloss of tips that I've gathered from organizations and other sources and just sort of made up while I'm on long international flights. And it's very important for leadership to keep doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is setting strategy and vision. That is, what is it we want to do? Like, as a business, what do we want to do? How do we want to do it? Like, I was talking with one of the organizers this morning, and there's this desire of, there's all these people who don't have bank accounts, and so we should do like non-physical banking stuff with them so that they don't just live in a cash society, right? That's kind of like a vision of a way you want things to be when you're done with it. Now, a strategy is something about how will we get there? What will we do? Like what things do we have that will allow us to do it better? Who are we competing with so we can try to block them or crush them? Like, how do we actually do the tactics of how we're going about things? And management certainly needs to do that. And at this layer, they don't really care if you use Ansible, Chef, or Puppet or anything like that. That's not their concern. They just want to make sure that you put in place the things needed to get to that point. So they probably care about compliance. So you should find Matt Ray, ask him about compliance. He'll give you a long lecture about it. It's very exciting. So they need to continue doing that. Now also, as we'll get into, they're going to be changing how the organization is structured. They'll change it around a great deal. They're going to change how teams operate. They'll probably have to change their compensation programs, all sorts of things. This is what we little people would call culture, right? They'll change what the processes are. And I don't know if you've ever tried to change the HR policy of like a 10 to 200,000 person company, but as an individual person with no reports in a cubicle, it's difficult. So you need the leaders and the executives to do this for you. And then, of course, ongoing, one of the key things that leaders are going to be doing is fighting for you, is championing for the cause that they have. Now, it's been, I'm sure no one in this room, your organization has this problem, but it's been my observation that in large organizations, you basically have fighting factions. You have a limited amount of resources in money, time, people, and essentially every time one of the executives who leads a business succeeds, another one fails. They call that stupid, or I'm sorry, zero-sum sort of thinking. And so oftentimes you'll need your executives to go zero someone out of the water, right? To go fight them and hold them back and make sure that you are not going to get sort of shut down by someone else. And then eventually they need to figure out how to be diplomatic with them and negotiate with them, which we'll get into a little bit. So it's very important. I guess I spend a lot of time when there's no managers to talk with, but maybe start figuring out with your management if they're actually doing this. And otherwise, I don't know if we're hiring locally, but we have a nice referral bonus, and Pivotal is always hiring for a place that's more aligned with this. So like I mentioned, one of the first things management is going to be tasked with, other than defending people who want to just destroy their organization on a daily basis. And by the way, PowerPoint is a great armor for organization destruction, is they need to change their structure around. So you've probably heard this in the DevOps world that you've got a silo-based approach, right? Now, typically you move into more of a product team-based approach, where instead of having you're developing QA stuff, like talking with each other and probably battling, you put all of the roles that you need together on the same team, right? So you've got developers, designers, QA people, hopefully operations people, although that's always a delightful thought exercise. But the managers are going to need to make those teams actual real teams that are combined together, and not just sort of like, as they would say, matrixed or sort of fantasy teams that are combined together. So getting to that point is very difficult to do on your own, and it's certainly something that management needs to do for you. So let's look briefly at what the actual teams do, what practices they follow, right? So you can get your DevOps report and their exciting diagrams of of correlation, not causation. They're very specific about that. None of this stuff actually causes anything. It just clusters together in a computer, and it's correlational, if that's a word. So the first thing on these teams, so one, you've got all the different roles working together. That's very important. But what you want to do is make sure that you're actually doing agile development, which most surveys that come out, if you look at the blue things, the blue part, and this is sort of practices that people have been doing. And if you look at this very quickly, once we get past refactoring, which is fine because everyone knows how to right-click on a mouse, so pretty much everyone can refactor, the practices fall off very quickly. So you should think, if we're going to be doing agile software development, are we actually doing agile software development? Because chances are you're not, right? Like chances are very high that you're not following the common practices. Now, I always like this was done in 2016, I always like the plan to do. I always think of that as the not ever going to do. So, just look at the blue instead. So next, just one of the tells that you can think about is, do we have these giant documents, or are we following a more agile-driven product management approach, right? Now, there's all sorts of benefits you get from not having a gigantic document, and instead having a more agile way of saying, here's a feature we're going to do this week, and here's a feature we might do in like 2 months. But you don't want to lock down what your requirements are too much. And there's a great science behind how that actually makes budgets better, how that actually is much better risk management that you would have. And of all places, you can see again the US Air Force talking about it, who are very interested in cost and risk management. But it's a good thing to look into to prove that we don't need to document everything up front. And we actually have better results if we have a smaller loop for the requirements that we have. So then the practices that people end up following to get these kind of results of being more productive is they do a lot, test-driven development and the balanced teams that I talked about. They follow all the things that you would read about best practices teams doing. And they really do get this productivity boost by combining all together, spending less time in meetings and worrying about requirements. And then they follow this other practice, at least organizations I've seen called, they do rotating pairing. Now, you've probably heard of paired programming. Otherwise known as what most people consider the worst idea ever in programming, except maybe the go-to statement. But in reality, not many people do pair programming, but what I've observed is that organizations, again, that Pivotal works for, why would I talk about any other sort of organization? They follow a pairing practice. And this means that not only like these happy developers down here, these are in Volkswagen, they're German, so you'll have to forget the lack of diversity. But you've got your programmers pairing together and the product managers and designers, and by virtue of pairing, they're not only teaching each other how to do something and also raising a huge amount of quality, but they also are doing risk management of learning in the organization, right? So you get all of the people kind of on the same page, and you don't have to worry about, as we used to morbidly call it, the bus count, right? Like how many people on your team could be hit by a bus and hopefully only taken out of action, and how would that slow down your team? Now, another great benefit of pair programming is when it comes to scaling your organization is over time you educate these people about the new way of doing things, and when you bring a new team online, they go to that new team and they teach them how to do it, right? They have a trusted internal source that they pair with, and this person spreads the knowledge of how things are going to operate and the new way of doing it. And they also have a tremendous amount of trust because it comes from the internal organization, right? Like someone like myself can come in and tell you how to improve your software, but really you shouldn't trust me because I just want you to buy something. But people who work inside your organization are going to be much more trustworthy, and so you want them to become the internal champions and change agents that you have. So the next thing, which gets finally to something vaguely related to computers, is what I find is that organizations who want to operate this way, they put in place a huge amount of software that's fully integrated together and extremely automated. They put together what we would call a platform. And inside this platform is, I mean, if you look at this, most people look at this and they say, hey, Coté, that looks like everything, which is exactly the point, right? Like if you are going to be focusing only on your software and being able to deploy your software multiple times a day, you don't have time to worry about everything, right? You need to integrate together all your middleware, all your infrastructure, the operations, right? Because it's easy to forget, like once we deploy the software, we would like it to run. So you're going to need some way of making sure it runs in production and you can update it. And then I'm told security is very important, but I sort of gave up on that a long time ago. It's, whatever. People like that. So we have a white paper that we wrote, and again, you can guess what the conclusion is about how you should solve your platform problem, but it will give you a good idea of all the things you need to have to be not only have a DevOps approach in place, but have an approach in place where you can be deploying and releasing your software every week and applying the small batch process to get actual good business results because your software isn't terrible. So here's our product. You should look into it. It's fantastic. Come down to the booth. We're the one with 3 banners. So I mentioned scaling tactics, and then I'll close out. I think the most important thing, I think maybe I have like 90 seconds left, so I'll steal someone else's time to talk a little bit longer. But the main thing that I like to tell people about scaling is you should lower your expectations, that's good life advice in general. I wish someone had told me that. Actually, my dad probably did, which probably explains a lot. But when you're starting your project out, you're going to be doing a lot fewer projects than you think you will be in the first year, right? Like you're learning a new methodology, you're using new technology, you're failing or learning if you remember. So you don't want to say, for example, rewrite your core .com site or like the way that you do your banking in a core system. You want to find applications that are real. So you don't want an application that schedules conference rooms, as problem that is. It has to be something that actually produces revenue for your company. But you also want it to be easy and not complicated, something that you can succeed at, that isn't too complex. And you start on a series of these projects, and this is from Home Depot. It's a representative line of the amount of applications that they did. I think I can't do calendar math very well, but over the first year you can see they started slow, and as they learned and were confident, they ramped up to doing that. Now, another secret of this is initially you choose small enough projects. If you remember how the other groups in your organization want to steal your resources and have you go away. So early on, if you fail, you should just hide it, right? Like pretend like it never happened. Because that will be used very quickly to get rid of you, and they'll say like, oh, this DevOps stuff is crazy. Look at this conference room scheduler project that they did. It didn't work. So therefore, my hair is a bird, your theory is invalid, right? And they'll totally kill off your projects. So you want to start off small and be able to hide failures that you have as you build up success. Now here's another reference of just kind of benchmarking how many applications organizations put into production in the first year to give you a realistic idea of how many different applications you'll have in there. So also you want to do a lot of internal marketing to kind of spread this out. But let me wrap up so I don't steal too much time from any questions you might have. And, you know, this is a fun picture back there. There we are talking with a whole bunch of people in Dallas about the wonders of cloud native and DevOps. We had pretty good food that day too, just like here. So if you're interested in more of that, you can come to this conference that we have in Washington, D.C. Although one of Matt Ray's friends informed me that it's actually in Maryland, but only someone in Maryland would tell you that. And also, if you want $200 off, I have a discount code here. I think if I sell a lot of these, I'll get a really nice pin. And I can always use a nice pin. I mean, who doesn't like a pin? So feel free to use that code if you want to come there. And essentially everything that I went over, I've stolen from people who've talked at this conference, or learned from, I guess. And so you'll see a lot of people who will go over how they transform their organization, things they learned from DevOps and other practices. And there's a bunch of recordings of them online too if you would rather pursue that. So all of the things I skipped over in more details you can get in this free little booklet. We unfortunately don't have any copies behind our 3 banners. All you have to do is lead gen yourself. Give us your email address or a fake one. I hear Mailinator is great. And you can get a copy of this, this PDF. You can read through it, ask me more questions, or not. So thanks for having me here. I'll be down at that booth here and there. And I'm pretty easy to get a hold of as long as you don't try to use the telephone. There I am in Twitter, and there's my email. And as with ongoing, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And now I'll, with a little bit of time left, take any questions people have as well. Or I could also go over more slides. I skipped a whole section on metrics. People love metrics for some reason. So there's that. But well, first of all, thank you. I appreciate it.
Explain more about the pair programming. I have his behavioral-driven as before, but I don't think so. Is there any way to do it more efficiently for the pair programming?
Sure, yeah. People are like, pair programming. So basically you halved my productivity and doubled my cost. Real genius suggestion there. And so like that does seem like what's going to happen, right? But what I've observed happening, and there's about, I would say there's about 10 years of good academic research before this. There's 20 years of academic research, but most of the studies that you'll find are like, you know, whatever grad students I happen to have in my class, I had them pair program, and I don't know, that doesn't sound like science. Just like that's weird. N equals grad students. But in the last 10 years, there's been more industry studies, and also anecdotally, we find this in organizations we work with, and what they find are the following. One, whenever you're working with someone else that has a different set of knowledge than you and might have more seniority, they not only teach you how to do the development, but they catch more of the errors that you have, right? And if you remember that old, this is like 80s lore, but like, or maybe 90s, like, you know, the earlier you catch an error in software, the cheaper it will be to fix, right? If you catch it in production, it's very expensive. So you want to catch the error as soon as it leaves someone's fingertips through the keyboard and into however a computer works. And so you do tend to catch more errors because you have 2 people looking at it, right? So that's the first thing, is your quality goes up, as in bugs. Now the second thing is that, and I mentioned this briefly, is that you spread the knowledge of how the system works amongst the team better, right? Now, it was my experience when I was a developer that once or twice every week we would have what we would tragically call a brown bag. And supposedly you would bring a lunch to a brown bag in a brown bag. But of course you would never do that because we're programmers, so we're going to go eat like a big buffet somewhere. So like you would have this meeting, and you would go there and someone would explain how the pagination framework works, right? Like you had one person who designed a component, and they're going to tell you how you could you could paginate your software, or I don't know, how you can do your transactional stuff. And then that one person is the Lord of Pagination, which that's a great title. I should be that for Halloween one year. And what happens is, not only is that from a managerial perspective very risky, right? Because the Lord of Pagination is going to want to get together with his ladies and princelings and go on vacation every now and then inevitably the pagination system is going to shut down, and whatever your customer needs is on page 30 instead of 1. So instead, if everyone is working on that system because you've socialized it around, not only are you managing that risk, but everyone has a chance to improve it. And also, you don't have to block on that one person to fix a bug, right? So in the DevOps world, if for those people who are like in the cult of lean, they focus on bottlenecks, right? and all of that. So they want to eliminate that sort of thing. So you get a much higher throughput on working on a system because everyone's familiar with it. Now the third thing is what I was going over. The benefit is that you can scale the knowledge to all sorts of organizations. Like after 3 or 6 months or a year, you can take some of those people on that team and you put them on a brand new team that might be equally skeptical and not knowledgeable about how to program and do DevOps, and those people become the trainers and they actually help those people out. And then this is also a great effect of pairing and training, is like you're actually producing working code, right? Like as someone is learning, they're not just creating like a pet shop or whatever, they're creating actual code that helps run the business and presumably is valuable for that business. So does that give you any hope or answer?
Yes, and do you swap the teams very quickly?
Well, usually the team as a concept stays dedicated to one product, so they only work on one product.
Oh, sorry, I mean the pair programmers.
Oh yeah, yes. So they at least rotate. I guess I glossed over that. They at least rotate every day, right? So you don't only program with the one person, you get to experience how other people smell throughout the week. But if you didn't rotate them, you would just have this, remember that Star Trek race where there's two people who, well, I guess they're not people, there's two of the creatures who are always together and they talk with each other? You don't want that situation, right? You want more of a Borg situation where everyone is connected together. I mean, they were successful, right? So that's a much better methodology.
Thank you.
So I think time's out. So thanks for having me, and I'll be around if there's more questions.